It's a growing epidemic, ruining lives and families. Heroin. And our communities are not immune. ABC 15 News is digging deeper to find out just how strong a hold heroin has on our community. It's your voice, your future, defining and defeating the heroin epidemic.
More than 52,000 people died from drug overdoses nationwide in 2015. 761 here in the Palmetto State. Drug ODs are now the leading cause of injury death in America, more than motor vehicle or firearms related. And more than half of those deaths come from prescription painkillers or heroin. Good evening. I'm Mark Hyman, host of Behind the Headlines. We're live at the Horry Georgetown Technical College. Thank you for joining us. The heroin crisis. Tonight, we talk about it. Now, we've assembled a terrific panel of experts who will answer questions and discuss this issue. Let's go ahead and meet them. Joining us this evening is Jimmy Richardson. He is the 15th Circuit Solicitor. Joe Hill. He is the Police Chief of Horry County. Dr. Paul Richardson. He is the Chief Medical Information Officer of Conway Medical. John Coffin. He is the Executive Director of Shoreline Behavioral Services. And Robert Ehrlich. He is the former governor of the state of Maryland. Now, we've got a lot of audience members here ready to go with questions they want to put to our panel of experts, but you at home can also join us in this important discussion. ABC 15 anchor Trey Paul is manning our social media desk. He'll explain how you can be part of the debate. Trey?
All right, a couple of ways you can join the conversation. Really easy. We'll start with social media. You can use the hashtag Heroin Town Hall on Twitter or on Facebook, or you can use the hashtag Your Voice, Your Future. So leave us a question on Facebook or Twitter. If you don't have social media, that's okay. We're going to do it the good old-fashioned way. ABC 15 News at WPDE.com. Just shoot us an email, ABC15news@WPDE.com. We're getting a lot of really good questions. Keep the questions coming. A lot of questions coming in, and no question is off limits. We're going to do our best to answer every question that you have. We've got a great team of experts here, and we're going to get to all your questions. And, you know, heroin is a really complex topic, and no one knows that better than ABC 15 Summer Dash. She's been investigating for the past year. She's defining heroin. She's putting a face with heroin. She's spent the past year working on that, and she's standing by with Mark right now. Summer, tell us a little bit more about what you learned.
Yeah, well, Trey, I think I've talked to probably every single panelist up here, probably half the room about this in my time covering heroin over more than a year. And I wish that I had some sort of concrete, finite truth about heroin, but I don't think that that exists. I think what I can tell you in my time covering the problem here on the Grand Strand and in the PD is that every single person who's been touched by heroin can make a difference, but it would take every single person to make that difference. So the story you're about to see is just a little tiny piece of this problem, and that's what you're about to watch now.
Addiction ripped away Shannon Mixon's nursing career, along with her 2 children.
And I could save you, but I could not save myself.
According to the CDC, since 1999, the amount of prescription opioids sold in the U.S. nearly quadrupled. But Americans aren't reporting more pain.
It's the physician's job in this country to help get us out of this mess.
Many experts, including this emergency room physician, point the finger at doctors for fueling the heroin epidemic by writing the prescriptions in the first place.
I can only give them warnings because I really work for them, even though sometimes I don't know if it's the best thing.
Pill dealers are continuing to abuse the system without fear because they're getting off with a slap on the wrist the way the laws are written now.
It makes our job harder.
Sergeant Tom Del Percio is still visibly frustrated when he talks about a 2002 bust, when a man who broke into a Walmart and stole some 1,300 OxyContin pills spent less than 4 years behind bars and nearly all the drug charges were dropped. Prescription pills don't fall under trafficking laws, but lawmakers are working on an update.
I think the need in South Carolina is not just trafficking, although that's one component of it, but really a comprehensive and maybe a holistic approach to fixing some of our laws.
State Representative Russell Fry has proposed a series of heroin-related bills.
You can't leave people suffering, so I don't know that this is a one solution. This is a multitude of issues that have created this problem.
4 years sober now, Mixon's kids are back in her life, and as you can see by her uniform, she's working again. Summer Dash, ABC 15 News.
When it comes to overdoses, there are no age, gender, ethnicity, income, or racial boundaries. Everybody is a potential victim. This is indeed a health emergency. Doctor, I want to start off with you. First of all, thank you for being here this evening. Many of us thought that heroin was a drug that was wiped out of existence after the 60s and 70s. Why is there this dramatic comeback?
Quite frankly, the comeback has to do around the fact that the availability and the low price. And a lot of these folks have wound up starting on pills. That gets very expensive, and it's a natural transition, unfortunately, for that patient to transition to an illegal drug, and heroin being so plentiful and so relatively cheap now. So that really is at the root of, I think, what we're seeing.
But doctor, that addresses part of the question, because Chief Hill, there's still people who are recreational drug users, right? And they've just gone through the progression of different drugs, and now it's time to give heroin a try. Is that not true?
That's true, and we find a lot of those folks are still trying to chase that next high.
Let's go to the live audience for our first question of the evening. First of all, thank you very much for joining. Step over here a little closer to me. Tell us who you are, where do you live, and what is your question?
I'm Beth Foster. I live in Conway, South Carolina, and I want to thank all of y'all because I've seen you around and about and doing the hard job of trying to fight it. But my question is one, it's real good to have everybody working, but the one thing that we need to do is we need to get this into the school systems. How do we do that?
That's a great question. I want to go with, I'm going to bring Governor Ehrlich into the conversation. You were governor of a state, similar size, not too far from here. What are the challenges on educating young people on any kind of danger, drugs in particular?
I heard the term holistic, by the way. I think we all, no matter how we got there, whether it's heroin, the opioids, we have a cultural problem. This is American culture. There is a demand across every line we tend to draw: ethnicity, race, sex, income, you name it. We all know it. The issue is whether we're willing as a culture, Mark, to deal with it firsthand. Everybody's on the front lines here, but again, it sounds trite, without the bully pulpit from the President of the United States, from Hollywood, from law enforcement, it's so overwhelming. It's touched just about every family, as you mentioned earlier, and without that sort of commitment, it's going to get worse and worse, and I don't see it stopping. We were able to do some things as a culture when everybody pulls together. Without that sort of recognition, and we're not even close to that recognition right now. In my view, we have a very limited chance. We can talk about one aspect of it, whether it's law enforcement or whatever it happens to be, but without that sort of cultural commitment, recognition, we have a problem long term.
Mr. Coffin, I'm bringing you in the conversation as someone who's got expertise in behavioral practices. The governor addressed an issue. Let's talk about popular culture. Just about a year ago, Saturday Night Live had a skit in which they were promoting a energy drink that was laced with heroin. And now we're at this point where it's kind of cool and fun and hip to joke about drug usage, particularly when it comes to such fatal drugs, potentially fatal drugs like heroin. How much is popular culture to blame for this?
Well, I mean, you have several interacting problems, and popular culture is a part of it. But when you're talking about the rash of overdose deaths, I think it's more connected to what was referred to earlier, which is people getting addicted almost by accident. A lot of folks go for pain management, and they actually don't have information. They don't realize how addictive it is, and it also, it's not as effective as you might hope for pain, particularly over time. So people find themselves addicted, and again, when you can't afford, when the doctor cuts you off, the pain management people cut you off, you're left to buying OxyContin on the street, and that's currently $40, $50 a pill, and heroin is much cheaper. And the other problem is, in respect to recreational use, I mean, that's really in the early stages of this. At the point at which you're talking about addiction, you're really talking about the absence of choice. People aren't doing it because it's fun anymore. They're doing it because they have to.
And Dr. Richardson, I also want to bring the solicitor into this conversation in a moment, but first I want to follow up on something that's been addressed. And we've had a number of doctors tell ABC 15 and our sister stations that they have to walk a fine line, because medical practices have an accreditation process. That includes inspections for things like pain management. And how do medical professionals manage pain? They often write prescriptions. And so we've had a number of doctors say, we're kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place, because if I don't manage pain, I could lose my accreditation. And then I have people walking in with magazine ads ripped out saying, I want this drug right here, and it makes your job as a medical provider difficult, doesn't it?
Makes it extremely difficult, and that's a great point and a great question. If several years back the government actually made sort of pain management or pain control the fifth vital sign, or whatever you want to refer to it as, and really hooked a lot of feedback, patient feedback, to was your pain controlled, yes or no, on a scale of 0 to 10, and this kind of stuff. So it really put a lot of pressure back on the physicians to perform, if you will, or to be able to meet that need. So it does. It absolutely does. And I give kudos, though, that the government has now taken a look at that and sort of removing some of that incentivization, if you will, to perhaps maybe be a little more aggressive in prescribing.
And Mr. Richardson, I want to bring in the conversation, because there certainly was a period of time, perhaps through the 80s and 90s, and even probably the early 2000s, in which the public attitude was, this is a crime enforcement problem. And if we lock them up, the problem goes away. You deal with this far too often. It's more than just a crime issue, isn't it?
It's a lot of issues all mixed in together. And I commend the governor for what he did in Maryland. I commend each and every one of these that are on the front lines. But what's happening is the crime part. What we're focusing on are the people that are trafficking in heroin and trafficking in opioids. And they referenced a little bit earlier a bill that would basically make trafficking in opioids the same as it would for heroin. And that's a good first step. We're not the first people that came up with that. That was actually recently done in Florida and has worked quite well. But every bit of this, when you drop a pebble in the water, there's going to have ripple effects. What happened in Florida is when they did get a lot of the Oxycontin, hydrocodone off the streets, there was a lot more heroin that came in. So we're trying to lock up the people that are peddling the heroin. And Mark, what we're seeing there is a lot of, unlike crack and cocaine, a lot of the people that sell heroin won't use heroin. We used to have it where people would sell cocaine and would cut it and use a little bit for themselves. Most of them avoid the heroin and just go out and sell it, and really doesn't mix the use of it. So to those, it's Tuesday. Monday we started with the trial, and the case ended up pleading, but that guy got 12 years on trafficking heroin, and he'll have to serve 85% of it before he becomes eligible for parole. So it's not one of these things, it's almost like an onion. You can't, there's not one magic pill. You got to reduce the amount of opioids that are coming in. You got to reduce the heroin that is already out there by getting rid of the traffickers. And then you got to educate the young kids that are coming along to make sure that it's not cool to do heroin. And to show photographs of, here's what Janie looked like 6 months ago, and here's what she looks like now. And the final piece to that is, it gets lost a lot, but there is hope. There's a lot of devastation going on. There's a lot of people in this audience that have turned the corner and are doing a lot better. So it is something that we can work through.
We're going to go back to the live audience. We're going to find out what's on this young lady's mind, and after we get your question answered by our panelists, I want to find out what our viewers at home think about all this. Please tell us who you are, where you live, and what is your question?
My name is Stephanie. I'm from Myrtle Beach, South Carolina. My question is, you mentioned the punishing the drug dealers, but what about the victims of this epidemic we're facing? We have private sector hospitals that nobody can afford. Is there a way, instead of punishing these poor victims of addiction, of hospitals, in emergency cases, state-funded, maybe possibly by private sector, or paying for by taxes in the state or funded by the government, instead of punishing them in jail and have them in a rotating door.
Governor, I want to have you address this issue, and I want to add something on to Stephanie's question. When someone gets cancer, the neighborhood comes together, they prepare meals, they set up a GoFundMe page, they set up a Facebook page, they rally around the family. When someone's an addict, they get shunned, ignored, and vilified by the community. Do we need to change society attitudes first to understand this is a medical problem at the very base of it, and perhaps we need to move forward?
Well, this is the great discussion and the great debate we've had in this country the last 50 years. I would say we've gone a little farther down that road. There's more empathy today than there was 20, 30 years ago. It's impacted more families. It's destroyed more people over the years. So yes, and again, it goes back to the people. It goes back to the voters. It goes back to, elected officials will respond to what the culture demands. Right now, we're not real sure. We sort of crossed the mess. We expect you, obviously, to lock everybody, all the bad guys up, but define bad guy. And that's your point. I haven't seen this debate in really substantive terms enough in congressional races and gubernatorial races and presidential race, quite frankly. But we're moving toward it, but very slowly, Mark. But the bottom line is, I think when you compare public attitudes now to 20, 30, 40 years ago, you're seeing more people say it is a public health issue as opposed to a criminal justice issue.
On the criminal justice side, Chief, your men and women in uniform are often the first responders at a situation. It may not be a fatal OD, but you come across those people who are addicts. And you must shake your head because he or she, that one addict, is not the only victim. There must be a family of victims, a neighborhood, loved ones, people that are close to them. Can you give us a sense, if you were to even make up a number, give us an idea of, for every victim every addict you come across, how many more people may be affected adversely, critically?
Sure. Last year, 2015, we ran about 263 overdose calls. In 2016, that number jumped to almost 600. So if you figure someone has a family, maybe they have a wife or a significant other and a child. So you're talking about 2 additional folks, not to mention the parents and everyone who cares about them in their work circle, their friend circle. So it just like the solicitor was saying, it has a ripple effect. It affects communities as a whole when one person is involved in this. And on the law enforcement side, we're looking at it in several different lenses. One is the enforcement. We have to stop the traffickers. But we're also looking at these folks that are victims. Yes, they make a choice to shoot heroin, but you can't keep putting them in jail. What is there else that we can do? Is there an intervention program? Is there a treatment program? So we're partnering with a lot of different private sectors to kind of introduce that into the flow.
A lot of questions from our live audience here, some detailed responses from our panelists. Our viewers at home have been weighing in this issue for several days now. So let's see what's on their mind. Trey, what do you have for us?
We have a question from Jan Rains on Facebook, and she used the hashtag Heroin Town Hall. You can too. Do you think the legalization of marijuana would reduce heroin use? And she also wrote, we have gotten quite a few people talking about this, so I think this is an important question. Mark?
I'm going to start off with the doctor. There's a lot of conversation going on about marijuana is a gateway drug, marijuana is safe. A lot of states are experimenting with recreational use, medicinal use. Are we moving too quickly in legalizing it? Are we potentially creating a bigger problem? Thoughts?
I think we probably are. Now there are a lot of, we are learning a lot about the effects of marijuana and in various medical conditions. Personally, I have never prescribed or been involved in that because it's obviously not legal here in the state. But I think we actually are maybe moving a little too quick. We probably need some more research in that area.
Mr. Solicitor, any thoughts to add?
I think before we do anything on the legislative side, we need to check with states that have already done it, like Colorado, and ask them, has their crime rate gone up or has their crime rate gone down after legalization of marijuana? We've got a few people that have decided to be guinea pigs on the subject, so just ask them and see, and not just get the loudest voice on the issue. See people that have really wrestled with it and how they're dealing with it.
We've got a number of people in the audience who have quite a bit of experience on issues like this. Please tell us who you are and what you do, and offer some thoughts on what you've heard so far.
I'm Tom Fox, I'm Chief Deputy at the Horry County Sheriff's Office. I think it's a great idea that the community comes together and discusses the issue of the heroin crisis. It's definitely a health crisis in our state, and it's going to involve more than just a community in Horry County. It's going to require a state effort, a federal effort for everybody to pull together and come with the different solutions. Every meeting we go to, several of the law enforcement people say you can't arrest your way out of this problem. I've been in law enforcement for 36 years, and 14 of those years I spent in narcotics, and I can attest to the fact that you can't arrest your way out of it. It's more of a social issue that's going to require commitments from legislators, funding sources to try to educate, treat, and come up with a solution to try to reduce the demand.
Assuming for a moment that you were all powerful and had unlimited resources, are there a few things that you in your experience would say, I wish we were doing this, I wish we had more of that?
Well, I think we need to get back into schools and go back to teaching the young adults decision-making models to stay away from experimenting with drugs, but also we need to come in with some public funding for long-term treatments.
But when we talk about the young people in schools and so forth, let's be realistic. Sometimes we have some role models at home that aren't very good role models, and so it's got to be difficult to tell these young people, these young adults, these adolescents, don't do the following, and they go home and they have family members doing exactly just that.
That's correct. I mean, a lot of children grow up mimicking the behaviors of their parents. So if you have poor role models in the community, you have poor results in the end. But what it's going to take is the community as a whole, the churches, the faith-based groups, and the community as a whole to pull together and to assist some of the parents that are struggling with addiction to help their children make good choices.
Mr. Coffin, I'll bring you back in the conversation because in some circles in this country, faith has gotten a bad rap. But for many addicts who've gotten clean, they often talk about how faith has played an important role in getting clean. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Sure. I mean, a lot of people, they recover in a particular way. It's kind of natural for people to make the assumption that the way that they recovered is the way that people ought to recover. So, you kind of develop factions on these topics, but there's a real place for faith-based recovery. The problem is not, you can't really push anything on anybody. People recover uniquely and in their own way, and part of the goal of treatment is to figure out, what motivates somebody, what's important to them.
We're back to the live audience. Sir, please step over here closer to me. Tell me who you are.
My name is DeJuan Huggins.
Where do you live and what is your question?
I live in Conway, South Carolina, thankfully back from Charleston. Pretty much my question goes out to Chief Hill and, of course, Solicitor Mr. Richardson. Going through someone who pretty much saw friends from high school go from smoking weed to going to crack cocaine, going to heroin, looking at them and looking at the heroin epidemic, we learned recently from EMT that it's becoming an overhaul for them to be able to respond to the calls. Then we get report that we're going to start training officers and loading them up with Narcan. Well, the EMT was complaining about the expensive cost of Narcan and whatnot. So is the issue of giving cops Narcan, is that more so the deal with responding to the OD calls, or is it more so the deal with trying to reduce the fatalities of death?
Chief?
We're looking at the chiefs in the area have gotten together with DHEC. DHEC has a grant program to train and equip officers with Narcan. The initial push for this was to protect the officers and first responders who come into contact with the opioids. As it gets on your skin, skin's your biggest organ on your body, officers can feel that effect, so we wanted to make sure we had the self-preservation mechanisms in place. As we look at the policy across the country with Narcan in the hands of law enforcement, to expand that out to possibly use that on citizens that we come in contact with. We're very rarely the first responders to folks that have OD'd on opioids. Usually it's EMS, they get the call, but on those rare occasions we'll have that tool in our toolbox to use.
And Mr. Solicitor, let's stay with that topic for just a moment. The ability to respond. Do our first responders need more tools in the toolbox the Chief mentioned? And talk about the importance of Good Samaritan laws.
Our legislature has really tackled this issue and been along with DHEC on this Narcan issue. It is loaded with Good Samaritan laws and making sure that if a person, a first responder, were to use Narcan, that they wouldn't be held accountable if there were some sort of complications because of it. And that was one of the big things. Other than that, I don't know much more that a first responder could do except to stabilize the situation. So other than Narcan, I just can't think of anything else that they would need at that time. And you addressed the question, the grant money is there for it, so it wouldn't be at any additional cost to the citizens of Horry and Georgetown counties.
And Dr. Richardson, those early moments after the OD are so critical to whether or not someone survives or doesn't, correct?
That is absolutely true. The fundamentals are still the fundamentals, ABC, airway, breathing, circulation. So you want to protect the patient, airway, you want to make sure they're breathing, because that's what the heroin is, right? It's a depressant, so it depresses their respirations. Like the solicitor and the chief were saying, the Narcan is extremely important as an antagonist to basically displace the opioid from the receptors in our body to reverse those effects. And we are seeing more of it out in the community now, more with the first responders. Our own foundation, Conway Medical Center Foundation, has given some money to help to fund that. And I applaud them for doing that, because it is critical. Those first seconds to minutes are probably the most critical time for that OD.
And while we're focusing certainly on this area of the Palmetto State and statewide, this is an issue that affects us nationally. We have someone who's got a little experience. Please tell us who you are, what you do, and your thoughts so far.
My name is Patrick Apel. I'm the resident agent in charge of the Drug Enforcement Administration here in the area. So I want to congratulate ABC for holding this forum and for all of the folks coming out here. DEA couldn't survive unless we work with our local counterparts with the state. Obviously, it's a nationwide issue. I received some information today that I just wanted to share. Obviously, Horry County is almost leading the state in the number of overdose deaths. Now, one of the things that I saw in a figure today in 2014, can anybody give me a figure of how many opioid medications were dispensed in Horry County? Anybody have any clue? Well, there's 640 people, I believe, that's the population here. Over 21 million dosage units of opioids were prescribed in Horry County alone. The only county that surpasses Horry County is Greenville. They had over 25. Now, the overdose deaths happening in the state are high here in Horry County and in Greenville. So you really have to look at this as a three-tiered problem. You've got obviously Mexican cartels that are living among us. We've got gangs distributing heroin and dope. And we've got doctors, frankly, that are no different than retail drug dealers. We have to start really looking at that. The community has to help us respond. And I just wanted to throw out, we have anonymous tip lines on DEA.gov, so we're here to work with the community, with local law enforcement to help put these guys in jail.
And to emphasize a point, according to the Centers for Disease Control, there are 102 prescriptions written for every 100 people in the state of South Carolina. The low is 51 per every 100 people in Hawaii. The high is 148 in Alabama. So South Carolina is right in the middle, probably not in a good way, at least if you look at the sheer numbers of prescriptions written for every person that lives in the state. Mr. Coffin, any thoughts on what our special agent had to say?
Well, there's related to the availability of pills. Recently, there were some recommendations that came out around physicians prescribing not the way they have historically, smaller doses for a much shorter period of time. But it's still not uncommon for someone to go maybe to a dentist for a toothache and come out with a script for 120. And interestingly, that person who may not be a drug dealer of any sort, but they come home, they realize, I don't need all these, my toothache's gone, and they realize they can sell them to a friend of theirs for $400 or $500. So there's many ways that that these things get out onto the street, not necessarily by directly by ill intent.
We're going to go back to the live audience, find out what's on this man's mind, and also want to give a shout out to Robert Edge, who's kind of trapped in our audience, but I want to bring him over to chat for a few moments. He's the coroner here in Horry County, but I want to find out what's on your mind. We're going to check with social media, and I'm going to hear from Mr. Edge. Please tell us who you are, where you live, and what is your question?
Well, my name is Ed Kellner, Myrtle Beach, and I'm recently retired. And actually, I don't have a question, but, well, I guess I do have a question. Are you guys ready for 2 new programs? I moved here from Massachusetts, and I work with the Gloucester Police Department and their Angel program. And what they do is, if I can go to the police station, check in, fill out some forms, hand over my equipment, and then I'm sent to like the ER. And then there's an angel there who will follow me through the process. And it's worked out real well. As a matter of fact, they got written up in the Journal of New England Medicine. And here tonight, I volunteer to be the first angel. It's a wonderful program. Also, Gloucester had a high-risk task force where members of different agencies in town would meet on a regular basis and talk about the people that they always see all the time. And instead of just seeing them all the time, they would get together and try to come up with a plan, a treatment plan. What could we do with Joe? You know, he's always here. What could we do? And they come up with a plan.
You made a good point. So for all of our viewers watching at home, if you want to be a part of this angel treatment program, join us on our Facebook page at facebook.com/WPDE ABC15. Tell us you're interested. We'll see if we can get you hooked up with this gentleman. Perhaps we can find a way to start something here. And I believe Governor Ehrlich wants to address this topic.
I want to go back to sort of the 1,000-pound monster in the room that was brought up earlier, which is marijuana. And the legalization, decriminalization, we've all been, if you're in public office these days, you have a very emotional side to this issue. But, and someone, Mark, you used the phrase earlier, gateway and all that. But we talk by this issue so much. There's 2 facts out there. Not everybody who tries marijuana gets addicted to heroin. We know that. Many don't. But in my experience with the state legislature and Congress and governor of the state of Maryland, I've talked to thousands of offenders, particularly juvenile offenders. And the next one who tells me it didn't begin with marijuana will be the first. So I think that's what the numbers prove. I think that's, I'm looking at the panel of experts here. So of course it's a gateway drug for some. It is. And so let's deal with it at that level. I think Colorado, we're seeing mental health issues that were probably unanticipated. Pot's different today than it was 30, 40 years ago. We all know that. So we all understand the economics. When you legalize something, the price goes down. Economics 101, we get that. But we tend to forget the social costs involved of legalizing something that makes you high.
Before I speak with Mr. Edge, I want to find out what our viewers think about all this so far. So let's check with our social media desk. Trey, what do you have for us?
Well, we've been talking a lot about Narcan, and Narcan, it can save your life. If someone overdoses on heroin, Narcan can save your life. So here's what Terry Egan wants to know. Does Narcan give a false confidence to heroin users? Good question there. We're going to check back with Mark now.
Mr. Coffin.
I've heard that, and I've actually heard police officers ask that same question, that people have Narcan and they think they can use more heroin because they can be rescued. I don't quite buy it. I mean, for us, there are enough people dying from this that really for someone to get into treatment, they need to live long enough to get there. And things like alcohol and marijuana, cocaine, all these other drugs, the risk of accidental death is nothing like what we're seeing with heroin.
And so, in your opinion, an addict is an addict, and they don't enter in the calculus whether or not there is some treatments available. They're just an addict, and they have a problem.
Well, you know, it's a chronic disease, and one of the features of the disease is an erosion of choice. So so once an addict, always an addict is really not something that's not how we address it. I mean, essentially, the average person comes into treatment 4 or 5, 6 times before they start really being able to sustain a recovery. And there's also multiple reoccurrences of use in that period. So, it's sort of like, you look at people and you go, well, what's your success rate? Well, it's hard to say. People don't actually ask that often about diabetes because everybody knows that it's a chronic disease that has to be managed, and you also have to have, the person has to get to the point where they're accepting enough of the fact that they have a disease to really begin to look at the self-management parts of it.
Robert Edge, first of all, thank you. I pulled you out of the audience. You're the coroner for Horry County. And for anyone who's watched at home, this is the last person who sees that individual who's had a fatal overdose. And it certainly must be unsettling for you to see any loss of life for any reason. But the people who show up in your line of work because they had a fatal OD must be very unsettling.
It is, and I think probably one of the most important things that these people can live very productive lives, and their choice of using heroin derails them, and lots of times it takes their life, and they miss out on the things that you and I are going to enjoy.
But Mr. Edge, we're focusing a lot on heroin. Of course, there are other opioids or prescription painkillers. No one's even used the F word. I'm talking about fentanyl. And fentanyl has been growing by incredible amounts here in the last couple of years, and it's 50 to 100 times more deadly than heroin.
Yes, and normally fentanyl is used in terminally ill patients who experience a lot of pain, and the people who are producing it are selling it to the heroin suppliers, and they're mixing it for a greater and a stronger high. And fentanyl is, in my opinion, what's really killing people more than the heroin itself. When the fentanyl came on board, we started seeing more deaths, in my opinion.
Thank you for joining us, and I hope I don't see you anytime soon. Let's talk about that, Mr. Solicitor, for a moment, because we've kind of divided along. We've talked about heroin, but there's so many other issues out there. Fentanyl has been flooding the markets all around the country, and as the coroner said, sometimes people don't know what they're getting in that drug they're taking. They think it's heroin, and it could be fentanyl.
Well, the guys that are selling it to you are not licensed pharmacists, so there's no real telling what you're getting in the heroin. And fentanyl is very cheap. It comes over as a synthetic heroin from China, and ours has been coming through Mexico and then up down the northeast corridor. But there are people, and through our DEU, we have seen people order it knowing that they were getting pure fentanyl. There are people that order fentanyl as opposed to other types of heroin. They call it white because it's a much whiter drug, and it is much more powerful. So there are people that don't know what they're getting into, but there are buyers that are specifically looking for fentanyl.
Chief, for this next question, I'd like you to speak directly to our audience at home. What should somebody be looking for? What are some of the signs if they have maybe doubts about whether they have a loved one, a roommate, a friend, an acquaintance who they believe may be addicted? What are some of the signs perhaps they should look for so at least they can ask more questions?
There's a lot of things, change in behavior, a loss of motivation or drive, missing pills. We have a lot of folks that are prescribed medications, as you've heard, and they go to check on their medications and it's reduced or gone completely. You've got a problem. We have drop-off boxes at most of the police stations around Myrtle Beach at their facilities so that you could get rid of this narcotic, this opioid legally. But these are just some of the signs, and I'm sure the doctor or the counselor can jump in and add some additional. But what you're seeing is a change in behavior. You know when something's wrong You just got to embrace it and start asking questions. And when you get frustrated asking questions from your loved one, reach out to some folks that can give you some real answers.
And Doctor, I want to bring back in the conversation, then I'll find out what's on this young lady's mind. But a number of parents who've lost children have told ABC 15 and our sister stations that as a parent, you cannot love your child out of addiction. No matter how hard you try, love alone won't do it. Care to address that?
Absolutely. The bottom line here is this is a potent draw for these folks. I mean, once it gets them, it has them, and love enough won't do it. That's correct. I mean, because they're looking for that next high. They not only need to, and the counselor could address this too, I'm sure more than I can, but it's a physical and it's a psychological addiction. I mean, they have to feed both of these, and that physical addiction is so powerful and so painful, and it, like he alluded to earlier, it goes from being recreation to being necessity at that point, and that's really where the trouble begins and where the tailspin starts.
We're back to the live audience, and after you and I speak, we'll get a chance to check with our viewers at home as well. Please tell us who you are, where you live, and what is your question?
My name is Amy, and I live in the Poplar community. And my question is, Governor Ehrlich made a comment that in order for things to ever be changed, it has to get to a higher level. And my question specifically is, being that I have been a parent who this month makes 1 year, I've been dealing with a child who is struggling with addiction. And I've made multiple trips to the solicitor's office, sit down with the sheriff, multiple phone calls, and I'm completely met with walls every time. Is there a way that I'm able to get statistics of under the age of 21, the number of violated laws there have been, the number of times that these have been in jail more than twice, allowed freedom to repeat the offenses, as well as the outcome of those circumstances? And the reason for that is because all of those things have been the case with my child. And if I'm going to go further, I think this is where I need to start. I need those, if I may.
Well, I can give you the answers in Maryland. These folks can give you the answers where to go to in South Carolina. But let me ask you this. When you use the term wall, what did you mean? Define it.
Well, the wall is no matter where I go, questions I ask, I'm told, I'm sorry, we can't help. I'm sorry, you need to call here. I'm sorry, you need to do this. And when I present the problems or the situations that are going on, I really feel like I'm given the runaround. And so what's happening is the counselor made the comment that the people need to get to the place to get help in order to actually receive it. They have to be alive that long. I feel like my child is not going to make it that long if I keep hitting these walls.
Okay. And she actually raises a good point, because we've seen this, our sister stations all around the country have seen this, that many parents say, I try to seek help and I get the runaround. Why is it so difficult to have someone come forward and say, we're the folks, we can get you in the right direction? Why is this such a challenge? I see you shaking your head, Mr. Coffin. Any thoughts?
Well, it actually kind of came into my head a little earlier related to another question, because the problem actually often isn't parents being able to figure this out. We get a lot of calls from parents who pretty much know what's going on, but the problem is their child is an adult in many cases, and they're not, we call it a pre-contemplation stage of treatment. They're not really thinking in terms of, I need help for this. So the problem is that the options are pretty limited if you can't get the person to engage. And that doesn't mean it's not incredibly painful for family, and the feeling of helplessness, I respond to that. I don't know how in a society like ours, where people have a lot of personal freedoms, that you can really force people to comply with things before they're ready to make a change.
And before I check in with Troy, I'm going to speak to our audience at home for a moment. Right now, it's gut check time. If you believe in your gut something is wrong with a family member, a roommate, a friend, yourself, chances are there is. Now is the time to step forward and say, I need help, I need counseling, I need to sort this out. Make today the day that you will survive for the rest of your life. Let's find out what our viewers think about all this. Trey, what do you have for us?
All right, first of all, I just want to thank everybody for all the questions. This question comes from Janice. When is Horry County going to get a long-term recovery center? A lot of people in the crowd.
The only way this question could be worse if it was an election year, right?
Yeah, I'd love to address that one.
Mr. Scott.
One huge gap in services is services for adult males between the ages of over 18 into their 40s, and the bulk of the population that we see, most of them are adult males, and most of them are in that category, and they are not eligible for much of anything. So it's a problem that continually affects us, doesn't get addressed, and a lot of problems result.
We've addressed some of the frontline peoples, the first responders, chief and so forth. We had, sadly, the one person we don't want to see, the coroner here. You're kind of the middleman. Please tell us who you are and what do you do?
My name is Chris Hawker, and I'm one of the intensive outpatient case managers at Shoreline Behavioral Health in Conway.
And what exactly do you do there?
What I do is I work with the high-risk folks that come in, usually the opiate and opioid cases. And, I think what Shoreline has started to do, and what a lot of people are realizing, is one of the most effective ways to encourage people to come into recovery is to use somebody who's been there. And that's kind of where I come in. I've been clean since 2010. And so it's helpful to be able to get on their level and encourage recovery and try to help them see change.
Well, first of all, congratulations to you.
Thank you.
There aren't many one and dones, are there? In other words, you see people multiple times.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not easy getting clean, is it?
No, it's not. And but at the end of the day, if it takes the right set of circumstances, and it's like Mr. Kaufman said, that the parents, we could want it for them all day long, the same way my parents wanted it for me. But until things got bad enough and I wanted change enough, that's when recovery can happen. And I think if we provide the resources at the right time for that person, then recovery can happen.
Could you name maybe 3 items that you think, if they fell into place, such as family or faith or whether it's medical treatment, what are the 3 perhaps most important things you would think should be considered for someone to pull it all together and begin that recovery process?
Well, I think for me, desperation is one.
You have to hit bottom.
Yeah, you have to hit some sort of bottom. And is one. Resources, like the local 12-step recovery, and just the availability of the resources. I mean, a lot of people want help and there's nowhere to go. If John Doe overdoses in Grand Strand Hospital or survives the overdose and comes out and he doesn't happen to have insurance, there's really no place for him to go except for back to the streets.
Chief, we must live in an interesting age where young people today all believe they're 10 feet tall and bulletproof and immune to anything. Is that a part of this problem?
It's hard to say. I think, and I've heard Chris's story numerous times, and it's a powerful story. I will never forget the first time I met Chris, he mentioned a loss of hope. And I think that's what you see in a lot of addicts is a loss of hope. And then they come to realize, I've got to do something different. But they've got to realize that. We cannot realize it for them, all the help in the world, their parents or educators or loved ones. They've got to want to do it for themselves. But to answer your question, you've got these young people out here that feel like they're invincible, but this helps. This education, the discussion, the multiple forums, discussion in the schools, peer support is huge for them. They need to see other folks in their age group, their demographic that's made it through this, suffered through it. They can talk to them about the struggles. All that's hugely important. But you're right, there's a sense of invisibility or invincibility for our young people in our community.
Governor?
No, so Chris, ma'am, I noted the tone of desperation in your voice. You need to talk to him in 10 minutes.
We're back to the live audience. Please step over here next to me, sweetie. Okay. Please tell us who you are, where you live, and what is your question?
My name is Jennifer Severs. I'm from North Myrtle Beach. So this is kind of the perfect timing. I guess it was going to be a follow-up to Stephanie's question, but since Chris just brought this up, we have dealt with this personally in my family several different ways. One of my family members went through detox and rehab. The other family went through the Suboxone program and counseling. 2 different routes, both were successful. However, the detox route, for an uninsured person that is hit bottom, what is available? You detox them at home. That's what we had to do. You're not qualified to do that. Tell me.
Well, I wish I had a great answer to that. Again, the detox programs, particularly medical detox programs, are some of the most expensive programs there are to run. Yeah. They're 24-hour services.
$500 a day.
They employ physicians. So, you know, again, without extensive support and really, I think, the will, which we may be getting there, the will from state and local governments. It's a very difficult proposition because the services are there in many cases, but very hard to access, and it can generate a huge bill for somebody who doesn't have any means to pay it.
Doctor, any thoughts?
These are, and congratulations on a success story of getting someone detox, but many of these medical programs sometimes don't have an end. Yeah. You know, sometimes the folks can't be detoxed. Some folks can, some folks can't. So it really takes a combination. It really does. There are some resources out there, but we're outnumbered. I mean, we're outnumbered. I mean, as medical providers, these guys for sure are outnumbered, and so it's a very tough predicament, and we need more resources. We do, absolutely.
Mr. Solicitor, we see a growth around the country in drug courts to take a different approach, not strictly a criminal justice approach, but a rehabilitation approach. Care to address that for a moment?
Yeah, it's the best thing I think we've ever done. Chris was one of our drug court graduates, and I think if when Chris was answering, the one thing that I would add to that is accountability, and I think that makes that takes you that next step. If you have gotten a huge sentence over your head, and then you have got the tools to get through it through drug court, knowing that you have to take all of these drug tests, that's a big thing in keeping people clean. The problem is you can't put but about 40 people in drug court at the time. So there's a lot more need than there is availability.
Doctor, I'm almost out of time. I've got about 30 seconds left. I'm going to give you the final word.
I think that folks just need to be educated, and this kind of thing is fantastic. And you know, really put your voice and lend your support to making more resources available, so we can have more folks like the counselor here, and because we won't solve this medically, it's going to take more than guys like me to solve this problem. And that they've talked about, we can't lock folks up. We can't legal our way out of this. So that's be my last thought.
And just to be clear, I'm actually not a counselor, but I do employ them.
And we've run out of time. Our nation has waged a war on drugs for years, and whether it's prescription pharmaceuticals, narcotics produced in makeshift labs, or exotic plants grown here or abroad, the results are always devastating, sometimes tragic. They often leave an individual, a family, a neighborhood, an entire community in despair. We've had a great discussion tonight. We hope you've learned something from this, something you can use going forward. On behalf of my colleagues, Summer Dash and Trey Paul, our panelists, our live audience here, and the fantastic crew of ABC 15, thank you at home for joining us. We're continuing the discussion on our Facebook page at facebook.com/WPDE ABC 15. Log on, tell us what you thought of tonight's town hall. Make certain you watch our late news for coverage of this town hall and all the day's breaking news. In closing, we'd like to salute our military, law enforcement, firefighters, EMTs, and other emergency personnel for their service to our communities and our nation. I'm Mark Hyman. Good night.